Thank you so much, Antonio, and thank you so much for having me. As Antonio already said, I am a fellow with the Mozilla Foundation where I work on data governance. And today I want to talk about how we might govern our data rather than being governed by it. Let's see, right? Yes, as we all know, over the last decade or even longer, we've seen so many privacy violations, data leaks, automated machine decisions made about us, about our workers. And all these scandals have resulted in us knowing pretty well what we don't want at this point. And what we don't want is no more platform dictatorships in which a few dictate the fates of many without their consent. We don't want any more machines making decisions about us based on faulty information or bad and often racist assumptions. And we don't want any more data collection for the sole purpose of selling us things or manipulating our behaviors. And in fact, when Apple decided to allow users to opt in or out of ad tracking, 96% of users decided to opt out, which shows me that it's no longer just the privacy advocates who care about these issues. It's the users themselves who are fed up as well. But while we increasingly know what we don't want, it's far less clear what we do want. And indeed, what we see, the response to all these scandals has been a largely proliferation of data regulations around the world. And the most famous one is, I think, still the general data protection rights regulations in Europe, but we see similar regulations all around the world. And those regulations focus largely on some notion of notice and consent, where we inform users that we want to collect data about them, and then they have the right to consent to opt in or out. Another cornerstone of these regulations is privacy by design, where we, as I'm sure you know, collect as little data as possible and only the data we really need. At least that's the law. Of course, whether that actually happens in reality is a whole different conversation. And what we're also increasingly seeing is governments trying to grapple with artificial intelligence and regulations around that. The European Union has recently proposed a law that regulates artificial intelligence, and we've seen similar things happening in Singapore and now also in China. But what these laws focus on mostly is curtailing harms. And that means there's still, and that's needed, right? We absolutely need that. But there's still a lot missing from it. And some of the missing pieces that I find are that we are not currently taking full account of the relational nature of data and that collective harms that may occur through its use. And what I mean by that is I, as an individual user, might decide that I want to share data about myself. And let's just pretend for a moment that's an actual decision and not me just randomly clicking a pop-up that asks me to install some cookies. Let's assume I actually make a conscious decision to share my data. That data may still also be about other people, right? If I share my DNA data, that's also about my family members. And even when it's supposedly mostly about me, you may still be able to infer things based on my data about people like me, like people in the same age bracket with the same demographics. And so our current regulations do not fully account for that relational nature of our data. Another thing that I find missing is that while we focus a lot on the harms, we're not yet focused on how we might share the benefits of all that data that's being collected and all these artificial intelligence that are being deployed. And what does that sharing look like? What do these benefits look like? How can I, as an individual or as part of a community, help determine what would benefit me? And that kind of brings me to the last missing piece, which is real collective agency of the collection and use of data and active participation in decision-making processes. And that means that instead of just clicking yes in terms of conditions, there's a conversation there. I can, instead of just accepting or not accepting a decision that's basically already made, I can have a conversation about, oh, actually, I don't mind you collecting this data, but I would like you to do X, Y, Z. Or I won't like you to not do these things, right? That conversation is currently barely taking place. And so for me, those are the missing pieces. And a very helpful framework to look at this is that Arnstein's participation ladder. Now, this has nothing to do with data and everything to do with citizen participation in general. But Arnstein created this letter to show like the different levels and versions of citizen participation in decision making. And at level 1, we find no participation and people are just manipulated, all the way to level 8, where we find full citizen control, where citizens really have active agency over their futures. Now, when it comes to our data regulations and data rights, we often find ourselves on the middle part. Oh, that's not where I wanted to go. And no, there we go. We find ourselves in the middle part of that letter, right? We are maybe informed about how our data is being used. We're maybe consulted and asked like, hey, do you generally like this or not? And this often takes the form of like users being surveyed, for instance. And in various cases, we're being placated, which is a little bit what Apple did when it allowed us to opt out of ad tracking, which subsequently turned out to actually not be that effective. And so from this, my somewhat bold statement is that if we really want to find out what we want when it comes to our data and what we want when it comes to artificial intelligence or automated decisions about us, when we want to have a more affirmative and positive vision of what that future should look like, we can't get there unless we have actual part in shaping those futures, unless we can actively participate and have actual agency. Now, luckily, I'm not the only one thinking that. There's lots of people with similar thoughts who have thought long and hard on what alternative models of this might look like. What might a model look like where we do have that participation? And of course, they're trying to solve a lot of hard problems, right? Like, it's easy to just say, oh, we should all participate and have part in decision making, but actually, what does that even look like? Are we all going to sit in a chat room and shout at each other? Like, do we actively want to be involved in every decision, or do we want to defer or delegate some of these decisions to other people? And so one of the models that has become more prominent is the data stewardship model. My slides are not, there we go. And in a data stewardship model, and now I will go on a little bit about all the various versions, but in a data stewardship model, in kind of the roughest version, you'll have data holders, and these could be people reflected in the data. So if it's health data, then it could be health. I could be, as a patient, who the health data is about, I would be a data holder. But when it comes to non-personal data, it could also be, for instance, if you have mapping data, data holders or data subjects could be the people who live in the places that are being mapped. Those people could come together in some way or collectively decide to hold over some of their rights and have them managed by a data steward or a group of data stewards. So a data steward could be a person or it could be an organization. And those data stewards then help create space for participation, create space for those data holders to decide between themselves what they want to do, and then enforce those decisions and make sure that the data is used and collected in the way that those data holders want. Stewardship entails. As I said, there are many different versions. You probably have heard people talk about data trusts, data commons, data cooperatives, even data stores. And all of these are different versions of data stewardship model. And depending on the version, you will see some different dynamics and some maybe a bit more focus on active participation by the people the data is about versus a bit more control of the steward in deciding what should be done with the data. But all these different models have a couple of things in common. For one, data stewards are independent intermediaries. And what I mean by that is that they don't have their own interest in the data. They don't care about the data. They're not using the data. They're not, they're not needing to use the data. They're just there to act on your behalf. And that is, yes, on your behalf or on behalf of everyone the data is about. And they are also, and this is crucial, accountable to those people. And these accountability mechanisms can take many different forms, but one form is by having the if the data steward has fiduciary duties towards those the data is about. And what that means is, just as your doctor or your lawyer has a fiduciary duty to only act in your best interest and to not be negligent, we could imagine data stewards having similar duties. And then equally, if they stop acting in your best interest, you can take them to court. So this would be a very strong legal right. Finally, what these data stewards do is ensure our collective participation in decisions over data and ensure that we can collectively participate in deciding how benefits derived from data can be shared between ourselves. And so that means that the data steward often also acts as a facilitator, facilitating these conversations between all of us, and making sure that there's a level playing field, making sure that when we have those conversations, the various interests are represented. Now, that's a data steward. And a lot of people out there are working very hard to realize this vision. However, while these concepts are very, very sorely needed, they remain very hard to implement as well. And there's a reason for that. And partially it's just because we don't have the rights, right? Like just creating a data steward doesn't mean that Facebook will give you control over all the data that it has collected about you. But another large part of the puzzle is that data is incredibly context dependent. And so it matters greatly whether we're talking about financial data that is about your transactions or data collected in the context of farming or herding cows, or data collected in the context of health and by your doctor, for instance, or in the classroom. All these contexts come with their own pre-existing dynamics. And so often it's not so much that the data itself creates all these different power imbalances. It's often that those power imbalances already existed. The relationship between a farmer and a supermarket was already very tense before supermarkets or tractor providers were able to collect data about farmers. Similarly, there was always a tension between you and the hospitals that you visit. But the hospital being able to use your data kind of reinforced that the power imbalance, similarly in classrooms, similarly in workplaces. And so when you start to look at those contexts, you start to see that actually, when we talk about data governance, we often talk more about good governance than we talk about data, right? It's more about the governance than it is about the data. And failing to realize that lets us down a really awkward path, which I call data ethics washing. So when we don't see that, for instance, no, let me first give you an example. Sorry. An example of like how the existing inequalities and inequities form how we fight about data is currently very, very visible in the fight over workers' data. Uber, for instance, collects lots of data about its drivers, and that data is used to manage them and to fire them often automatically. And organizations like Worker Info Exchange are trying to get hold of that data so they can inspect it, they can interrogate it, they can understand how Uber is making those decisions and then try to overturn those decisions. Now, this is incredibly important work, but if we talk about the governance of that data, what are the questions? What would good governance look like here? And actually what good governance looks like is that the workers would have control over what kind of data is collected about them in the first place. But then in the next step, would have some control and agency over how that data is used. And now suddenly we're not just talking about data anymore, we're talking about how workers may or may not be managed by their employers, right? This is not, data is kind of the entry point in the to the conversation, but it's not itself the entire conversation. And this is really why I say like the governance matters more than the data. And yes, like I said, failing to see that leads us down a dangerous path. It leads us down a path where companies use words like data trusts or data fiduciaries to implement everything they wanted to implement anyways, to continue to collect data about us, but make it sound good and make it sound safe. But if you actually look under the hood of those plans, you may find that those pre-existing power dynamics and those pre-existing economic inequities remain unaddressed. And so it's a bit of like ethics washing and PR rather than actual good data governance. Now, to kind of as a last bit of this talk, I wanted to, instead of just say, don't do that, I wanted to give you some idea of what to look for when we talk about good data governance. Like, what should we even be looking for? What are the red flags, but also what are the green flags? And basically any governance system, good or bad, consists of these components. There is someone deciding things and they make these decisions in specific ways. For instance, in Facebook's case, it's Mark Zuckerberg deciding. I don't know how he decides. Maybe he gets out of bed in the morning and just has a decision. And then the purpose and value is mostly to do with making money. Rules are set by developers, by the leadership. I don't know how they're monitored. They're enforced probably relatively automatically. And dispute resolutions happen by users clicking, I don't want this anymore, get me out of here, or like block this content or block this user. Now, I would say that's not an example of good governance. I think most of us agree with that. But what does good look like, right? So let's start with the purpose, values, and stakeholders. In good data governance, these boundaries, and they really act as boundaries, they bound our context, are very clearly defined. So we have a very clear idea of the purpose of data collection. Why is this data collected? And when I say clear, I mean, instead of saying, we're collecting data to improve the health of everyone in this country, that's vague, you can't measure it. Instead, you could say, we're collecting data to cure this specific disease that occurs in this specific person. And then we can be very concrete about who is collecting that data and how they're using it. And suddenly you get even more of a boundary. And then also, like, how is that data collected, right? Is it collected to a survey where people have a sense that it's being collected, or is there a camera in the room that no one knows about? So once you start answering these questions, you create your boundary. And it becomes a lot more clear who is affected by what you're going to do, who should be involved in the decision-making process, and what kinds of questions you should be asking around the risks and the harms of what you're doing. That brings me to the next step, which is the who decides. And as a rule, those, like anyone who is affected by a rule or a decision should have a voice in making that decision. That doesn't mean we also always have to have consensus. That would make the world very impractical. And it doesn't mean, it doesn't even mean that we all have a vote, but it means that we all have an we actively participate in that decision coming about. If it affects us, we should have some participation. And that means that it's clear what is being decided, that we know that that decision is happening. It means that those who are kind of starting this decision-making process have a sense of who should be in the room, which like relates back to what I just said about creating a good context. It also means that if you have lots of different actors in the room with very different abilities of voicing their concerns, that you take some measures to level the playing field so that a corporate lawyer is not sitting at the same table as a underfunded activist. You need to raise the profile of the activist in this case. And then there's a question of how are decisions made. And I'm not going to tell you what good looks like here. I mean, I generally think one person making decisions for everyone is probably bad. But if everyone consented to it, that may suddenly look like a good way to do it. But there needs to be some clarity about how this decision is going to be made. So now we have the context and we have the core. Let's look at all these things around it. And first we have the creation of the rules themselves. Broadly speaking, we would like those rules to be more shared agreements than rules. So more towards the direction of the shared agreements and away from like, this is what you should be doing. Once you have rules around how data can be used, how it can be accessed, how it can be collected, you need to monitor that, right? You can't just say, well, you have to do this, but we're not going to observe whether or not you are doing it. No, you have to monitor it. But then also, the information of that monitoring needs to be broadly shared. This is what we largely refer to as transparency. And it means that if you say that you're going to use my data for this thing, and you need to monitor, and I need to be able to monitor that you are using it for this thing. And obviously not all of us are going to every day go through the logs of how our data is being used, but it's more that those who want to should be able to. Thirdly, very important, the accountability. If rules are continuously broken without people being held accountable in an appropriate way, we're going to not trust that they're actually rules anymore. We're going to just be like, well, that's a thing someone said that one time, but we're not going to listen anymore. And we're not going to trust the system that creates those rules, right? So our trust in the governance system starts to deteriorate. It does also mean that the rules should be, like accountability measures should be fair. If I break a rule by accident one time without a large consequence, I shouldn't be held accountable in the same way as someone who does it intentionally and maybe at large scale. And then finally, even that person who is intentionally causing harm should have a way to regain trust with the community or with the governance system. Finally, even in the best of times, when humans come together to make decisions together, they're going to have conflicts. There are going to be some disputes. Those disputes may be about the rules themselves. They may be about how the rules are monitored. They may be when someone is held accountable. They may not agree with that. But it may be about something else entirely, right? If you have a platform with users on them, those users are going to disagree with things, and they're going to want a place to voice those disagreements. So how disputes are handled, what kinds of pathways you establish for people to do that, really helps me understand whether you have a good governance system or not. And for instance, that means clarity on where to go if you disagree with something. It also means clarity on whether those disputes will be handled in-house or whether you will defer to an external court. Like, that matters to me. So this is not, I'm not being super prescriptive in like, this is how you should do it. But I'm saying like, you need mechanisms in place to handle disputes around data, but also around like the organization at large. So that brings us back to our little, or my little drawing. Let's see. I think the slide is basically not moving. There we go. And so for all of these things, we can have some opinions about how they should be created and what should be done. And I use this as a scan for when someone tells me that they've built a great governance system and they're going to handle the data in a terrific way and they have nice marketing around that. This is what I use as a scan to see like, wait, are all those things really in place? And finally, and this will be my closing remark, you cannot governance yourself out of a bad idea. Some things you really should just not be doing. And this is true, for instance, for a lot of the facial recognition software that we deploy, and governance around the world are speaking out about this and are now not allowing that anymore, because actually most of the use cases of facial recognition are bad. And so we can create all the beautiful governance systems around that, but if the core is rotten, we're not going to get to anything beautiful, right? So in that case, the answer is no. Go do something else with your life. But if you've decided, no, actually, this is worthwhile, but there are risks and there are harms, and we have to understand, we have to weigh those against the benefits, and we have to see if they're acceptable, and we have to see what we can do about this before we start to talk about governance. And then finally, the question I really would like everyone to ask is like, even if it's a good idea, even if the harms and risks are acceptable, are you best placed to execute? And the reason I say this is like, there are lots of very well-meaning initiatives of people who collect data on their own behalf. They have a very good purpose, some great values, but they don't have the resources to pay for the security they need to build in to finance the security engineers they need, or they don't have the volunteers to do this for them. In which case, if your entire plan relies on the data being held securely and being encrypted, and you can't afford to encrypt the data properly, you should probably not be doing this. So those are the questions to ask before we even start talking about governance. That's all I had to say for now. thank you so much for listening and indulging me. I am happy to ask all the questions right after this talk. Is it just me that slides are not showing up properly, or is it a general thing? I think my laptop is now frozen. There you go. Thank you so much.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much, Anouk. Eduardo, adelante.
Muchas gracias, Antonio, muchas gracias, Anouk. Justo estaba abriendo mi presentación para poder compartirla con ustedes. Bueno, antes que nada, agradecer a Anouk por todas las perspectivas que ha compartido con nosotros. Creo que justamente parte de lo que queríamos hacer el día de hoy era tener como un diálogo, ¿no? Un diálogo, como decíamos, norte-sur, y tener un poco la oportunidad de compartir cuáles son los desafíos que nosotros vemos en particular para América Latina frente a estos temas, ¿no? Porque obviamente algo que surge muy claro en todo esto es que muchos de estos desafíos que nos está mostrando Nuc tienen que ver en cómo nuestras organizaciones, cómo la industria tecnológica logra estructurarse de cierta manera para poder llevar a cabo estas acciones, ¿no? Estas guías que nos presentaba Nuc. Y aquí hay algo interesante. Nosotros, solo utilizando un ejemplo, antes de entrar a la parte más de latinoamericana, si nosotros pensamos en una organización que tiene una relación de poder muy vertical o una relación que tiene una organización de poder muy horizontal, no van a ser los mismos desafíos. Eso es algo que lo tenemos muy claro. Pero ahora pensemos un poco más en el detalle para América Latina. Nosotros sabemos, los que trabajamos en esta industria, los que tenemos contacto con también otros países, otras regiones, sabemos que la forma en que se estructura una industria, la forma en que se estructura un sector económico, está esencialmente determinada por la forma en que nuestra sociedad funciona, la forma en que nos relacionamos socialmente. Y en realidad la industria tecnológica latinoamericana no está necesariamente estructurada de la misma manera que la industria norteamericana, que la industria europea o la industria asiática. Nuestros gobiernos no tienen las mismas capacidades de abordar, justamente Anouk hablaba de este tema de las leyes, por ejemplo, no tienen necesariamente las mismas perspectivas, las mismas capacidades hasta tecnológicas, de conocimiento tecnológico para abordarlos de la misma manera este problema. Entonces, lo que nosotros queríamos traer ahora era como cuáles son los desafíos que vemos para América Latina, ¿no? Y en ese sentido, yo quería comenzar primero poniéndoles esta imagen, ¿no? Esta imagen que es una imagen que es muy fuerte, creo yo, en el mensaje que queremos dar en este sentido, es este famoso cuadro de uno de los pintores latinoamericanos más importantes que hemos tenido, Osvaldo Boyasamín, que hace este cuadro sobre el mestizaje en América Latina, que es parte de una colección que se llama El despertar de América Latina, que nos invita a pensarnos a nosotros mismos, en nuestro mestizaje, en nuestra propia historia, en nuestra propia particularidad. Y yo lo utilizaba esta imagen justamente para preguntarnos desde esa identidad nuestra, de esta particularidad nuestra, de nuestra forma de relacionarnos, de nuestra forma de entender y de desarrollar las relaciones económicas, ¿qué desarrollo tecnológico queremos crear? ¿No? Esa es la primera pregunta en términos de particularidad latinoamericana. ¿Qué desarrollo tecnológico y por ende, qué forma de la industria tecnológica queremos construir, ¿no? Si nosotros utilizamos algunas de las guías que Anouk nos trajo en su discusión, podremos decir, muy bien, nosotros podemos traer esta tecnología hacia nosotros, traer estas guías, pero ¿de qué forma se aplican a nuestra realidad, ¿no? Entonces aquí justo traía solo como ejemplo esta frase de uno de los economistas más importantes que ha tenido América Latina en las últimas décadas, el brasileño Teotonio dos Santos, que decía esto, ¿no? Que el concepto hegemónico de desarrollo finalmente es una máquina del olvido, si no tenemos una visión crítica de este concepto, ¿no? Entonces, ¿a qué nos referimos con esto? En América Latina, comencemos por aquí. Uno de los de los desafíos principales que tenemos es el desafío de tener una visión crítica sobre este tema de reducir la brecha tecnológica. Este es un debate que tenemos que es muy similar al tema del desarrollo y el subdesarrollo, ¿no es cierto? Que decimos, somos países desarrollados, tenemos que desarrollarnos, entonces tenemos que llegar a donde están los que ya están desarrollados. Pasa lo mismo con la brecha tecnológica. Muchas veces decimos, estos países ya tienen un cierto desarrollo tecnológico, podemos hablar de Norteamérica, de Europa, de ciertos países en Asia, como China, y decimos, queremos llegar allá. Pero en realidad muchas veces lo hacemos sin tener una visión crítica de esto, ¿no? Sin tener una visión crítica es como decir, queremos ir del punto A al punto B, sin preguntarnos si es que eso realmente va a corresponder a nuestra realidad. Y para desarrollar esta visión crítica y no caer en esta máquina del olvido, que finalmente es máquina del olvido de olvidarnos quiénes somos y simplemente querer imitar, tenemos algunos desafíos importantes, ¿no? El primero es, como industria tecnológica, tenemos que desarmar, tenemos que destruir este mito de que la tecnología podría ser neutra. Uno de los mitos fundadores de la industria tecnológica y que aún nos cuesta mucho abordar es que la tecnología no se trata de si tiene buenos usos o malos usos, como si la tecnología en sí fuera neutra. En realidad, la tecnología tiene política intrínsecamente. La forma en que nosotros hacemos código y desarrollamos código es una forma política de hacerlo código. Anuk hablaba, por ejemplo, de los temas del racismo, de los temas de los sesgos que se ponen en el código. Tenemos que asumir que la tecnología no es neutra, y cuando hablamos de la brecha tecnológica y traemos tecnología, muchas veces se lo desarrolla así, ¿no? Nuestra industria, decimos, traigamos tecnología que existe en otros lugares, pensemos en cuál es la política, abramos esa caja negra de la tecnología, abramos, veamos qué está dentro y veamos quién la construyó, para quién la construyó, a quién le funciona, a quién no, cómo eso funcionaría en América Latina. Las personas para quienes pensamos de esa tecnología, ¿existen en nuestro contexto o no? Entonces, en ese sentido, si aplicamos las guías que nos decía Anuk, pensar cuáles son los usuarios de esos datos, quiénes son estos grupos que van a pensar esta gobernanza de datos. Tenemos los mismos tipos de usuarios, tenemos los mismos tipos de capacidades, los mismos tipos de formas de organizarnos para hacerlo o no. Lo mismo pasa con la transferencia tecnológica directamente. Traemos un cierto tipo de estructura tecnológica, de arquitectura tecnológica. ¿Tenemos nuestras capacidades desarrolladas en nuestra industria para desarrollar estas guías o no? ¿O necesitamos transformar un poco de esta arquitectura para que corresponda a nuestras capacidades en nuestra industria? Y además, ¿queremos ir hacia allá o queremos ir hacia otros lugares, hacia otro tipo de arquitecturas tecnológicas? Ya en términos más grandes, eso digamos hacia adentro de la industria, ¿no? En términos más grandes, Anuk habló mucho, ¿no? De esto, de cómo hay el control ciudadano de la tecnología, cómo son importantes las leyes, por ejemplo, en el tema de la gobernanza de datos. Y aquí tenemos que pensar cómo la industria tecnológica se conecta al resto de la sociedad. La industria tecnológica históricamente, no solo en el norte global, sino en el sur global, también ha sido una caja negra que primero que nada no ha tenido la misma diversidad de trabajadores y trabajadoras que representan a la diversidad de nuestra sociedad. Muchas veces han sido hombres blancos que han dominado la industria tecnológica, cuando nuestra diversidad latinoamericana es mucho más grande. Abrir esta caja negra de la tecnología quiere decir relacionarla con la sociedad, primero en quién trabaja en la industria tecnológica y segundo, cuáles son los procesos participativos que abrimos hacia la sociedad. Los procesos participativos además no van a ser los mismos en América Latina, con nuestras historias de participación, con nuestra cultura participativa, que van a ser, por ejemplo, yo sé, en Europa del Norte, cómo pensamos esos procesos participativos aquí y cómo rompemos esta idea de que simplemente el desarrollo de la industria tecnológica va a traer desarrollo para toda la sociedad y bienestar para toda la sociedad. Tenemos que pensar qué industria tecnológica puede conectarse con el resto de la sociedad para generar este desarrollo, ¿no? Hay muchos de estos desafíos que podríamos ver aquí, pero la pregunta fundamental que yo voy a poner aquí es esta. Siempre preguntamos, cuando nos preguntemos en estas dinámicas de transferencia digital, de ver hacia otros horizontes, para tal vez tratar de imitarlos o de transferir tecnología, preguntarnos para quién funciona la tecnología, para quién funciona esa tecnología que estamos tratando de traer hacia acá, y si funcionaría de la misma manera, para quién aquí. Solo traigo un ejemplo, que no vamos a entrar ahora en este detalle de esto, pero Anuk ya lo mencionó un poco, ¿no? El caso de los trabajadores y trabajadoras de plataformas. Es muy interesante, es un tema que podríamos verlo de una forma muy interesante, pero los desafíos, por ejemplo, para América Latina no son los mismos cuando hablamos de datos y cuando hablamos de gobernanza, de gestión del trabajo, de la tensión entre capital y trabajo en América Latina, no son los mismos en América Latina que en Europa. Por ejemplo, nosotros aquí tenemos un desarrollo mucho más grande del trabajo precario de migrantes irregularizados que se ha transformado en una forma generalizada de precarizar los derechos laborales. Tenemos personas que son invisibles para las plataformas, pero que están trabajando todo el día en estas plataformas, con estas plataformas, bajo las reglas de estas plataformas, que son invisibles porque ni siquiera tienen cédula, no tienen cuentas bancarias, no tienen tarjetas de crédito con las cuales pueden entrar aquí, sino que son terciarizadas por otras personas. Eso es solo un ejemplo de cómo se estructura una periferia digital en nuestros continentes. Una periferia digital que está hecha de precarización, que está hecha de colonización. También, ¿hacia dónde van los datos? Los datos se quedan en América Latina. ¿Dónde están los servidores? ¿Qué capacidad legal tenemos nosotros para afrontar los desafíos de soberanía de datos que queremos tener ahí. Son algunas de las preguntas que tenemos que hacernos en este sentido, ¿no? No voy a ahondar mucho más porque queremos dejar tal vez un poquito de tiempo para un par de preguntas, pero solo les quiero invitar a ahora, vamos a tener una charla ahora a las 11 de la mañana, hora ecuatoriana, creo que es 1 de la tarde en Chile, para mostrarles un poco el manual de tecnología responsable que hemos generado nosotros, que lanzamos hace poco tiempo, que recopila algunas herramientas para tener estos debates, ¿no? Para tener estos debates del impacto social, de para quién funciona la tecnología, para quién no, para quién le excluye, a quién excluye y a quién no. Entonces les queremos invitar a eso, va a ser a las 11 de la mañana, vamos a tener como ya un detalle un poco más en estos debates y cómo podemos utilizarlos nosotros y nosotras como desarrolladores, como diseñadores, como expertos de usuario, de referencia de usuarios, de analistas de negocio, todo esto, ¿no? Entonces, más que nada eso, invitarles a esta charla que viene a las 11, agradecerle a Nuki y creo que vamos a dejar un pequeño momento si es que hay espacio para preguntas.